There was no passbook, my daughter-in-law said, her voice light, almost amused, as if she were correcting a silly mistake. I remember the exact way she smiled when she said it. Calm, certain, final. And for a moment, I almost believed her. At 72, you start to question your own memory. You wonder if maybe you did misplace things. Forget things. Maybe my father had never given me anything after all. Maybe I had imagined that afternoon on his porch, the way his hands trembled slightly as he pressed that small, worn booklet into mine. This is your safety, he had said. I can still hear his voice, low and steady, like he was telling me something important, but didn't want anyone else to overhear. I didn't argue with her. I didn't ask another question. I just nodded, like it didn't matter, like it was just another old thing lost to time. Jessica turned back to the sink, rinsing dishes like the conversation had never happened. My son, Daniel, sat at the table scrolling through his phone, not even looking up. That was the part that stayed with me. Not what she said, but what he didn't say. He used to notice everything about me. When I was tired, when I was quiet, when something was wrong. Now, he didn't even lift his eyes. The kitchen felt too bright that afternoon. Sunlight pouring through the window, catching the dust in the air, making everything look clearer than it really was. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel, folding it carefully before setting it down. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, I said, keeping my voice even. Jessica laughed softly, not unkind, but not kind either. It happens, she said. Those old things, they don't mean much anyway. Old things. That's what she called it. I nodded again. Then I went upstairs. My room was exactly the same as I'd left it that morning. Neat. Quiet. Still. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember the last time I had actually seen that passbook. Not just remembered it. Seen it. Touched it. I couldn't. That was the problem. The memory of my father giving it to me was clear. Too clear. But everything after that was fog. I stood up and walked to the closet, pulling down the small box where I kept old papers. Insurance documents. Receipts. Letters I never threw away. I went through them one by one, my fingers slower than they used to be, but steady. No passbook. No envelope. Nothing. I sat back on the floor, surrounded by pieces of my own life, and for the first time, I felt something shift. Not panic. Not yet. Just awareness. The kind that starts small. Quiet. Like a thought you don't want to finish. I thought about Jessica again. The way she answered too quickly. The way she didn't ask what I meant. Didn't pause. Didn't wonder. Just dismissed it. People don't do that unless they already know the answer. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't bring it up again. I watched. That was all. I watched the way Jessica moved around the house like everything belonged to her. The way she spoke for Daniel when I asked simple questions. The way Daniel let her. I watched the way my own life had slowly shifted into the background, piece by piece, until I was just there. Present, but not included. Later, when the house was quiet and the lights were off, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I stared at the empty space in front of me and tried to decide if I was being foolish. If this was just another case of an old woman holding on to something that didn't matter anymore. But my father's voice wouldn't leave me alone. This is your safety. He wasn't a man who said things like that lightly. He had worked 30 years at the same company. Never missed a payment. Never made a promise he couldn't keep. If he said something mattered, it mattered. I looked at my hands resting on the table. They didn't shake. That surprised me. I expected fear, confusion, but what I felt instead was something colder, clearer. I stood up, rinsed the cup, and placed it carefully in the sink. The house was silent. Jessica and Daniel were asleep upstairs, unaware of the thought that had just settled in my mind. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and stood there for a moment in the dark kitchen. Then I made a decision. I wouldn't ask again. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't try to remember harder or convince anyone of anything. I would verify, quietly. The next morning, I got up before anyone else. I dressed slowly, choosing the same coat I'd worn for years, the one with the deep pockets. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make a sound. When I stepped outside, the air was cool, the kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. I locked the door behind me and walked to my car. The drive to the bank was familiar. 15 minutes down the same road I'd taken for decades. Past the same grocery store. The same gas station. The same church on the corner. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything felt different. I parked in the same spot I always used and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I wasn't nervous. That was the strange part. I just wanted to know. I opened the door, stepped out, and walked inside. The bank smelled the same. Clean, quiet, controlled. A young teller greeted me with a polite smile, but I asked to speak to a manager. She nodded and led me to a small office near the back. A man in his 50s stood up when I entered. "Margaret Collins?" he asked, glancing at the screen. I nodded. "I need to check something," I said, placing my purse gently on the desk. "An old account. A passbook." He hesitated for just a second. Then he turned back to his computer. "Do you have the account number?" I shook my head. "No, but it would be under my father's name. Robert Hayes." He typed slowly. The room was quiet except for the soft clicking of keys. I watched his face. At first, nothing changed. Just routine. Then, something did. His posture shifted. Slightly. His eyes narrowed at the screen. He leaned in closer. "That's strange," he murmured, almost to himself. My fingers tightened just a little on the edge of the chair. "What is?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He clicked again. Scrolled. Then he looked up at me, his expression no longer neutral. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "This account, it never closed." He turned the screen slightly, as if deciding how much to show me. "It has been active for years," he said, his voice slower now, more careful. "And there have been regular transactions." I did not move. I did not ask him to repeat it. I just looked at him and waited. "What kind of transactions?" I asked. He hesitated again, then turned the monitor fully toward me. Numbers filled the screen. Dates. Amounts. Small at first. $50. 100. Then larger. 500. 1,000. Every month. Like clockwork. My eyes moved down the list, trying to understand what I was looking at. "These are withdrawals," he said quietly. "Consistent. Scheduled." My mouth felt dry, but my voice stayed steady. "From where?" He clicked once more, opening a detail I did not recognize. "Transferred to another account," he said. "External." I leaned forward just enough to see the last few digits. It meant nothing to me. Just numbers. Cold. Unfamiliar. "Can you tell who owns that account?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment, then back at the screen. "Normally, we would need authorization," he said. "But since this account is in your name," he did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. He typed again, slower this time. Deliberate. Then he stopped. Completely still. The kind of stillness that tells you something has just changed. "Ma'am," he said, and now his voice was different. Not just careful. Concerned. "Do you recognize this name?" He turned the screen again. I read it once. Then again, as if reading it a second time might change what it said. It did not. Jessica Collins. I sat back in the chair, my hands resting in my lap. I did not react. Not outwardly. Inside, something settled into place. Quiet. Certain. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. He scrolled up. "About 5 years," he said. 5 years. I repeated the number in my head. 5 years of small withdrawals. 5 years of money moving quietly, unnoticed. 5 years of me believing I had nothing. I nodded once. "Can you print this?" I asked. He nodded quickly, as if relieved I was not asking anything more complicated. The printer hummed softly in the corner, filling the room with a steady mechanical sound. I watched the paper come out, page after page, each one holding a piece of something I had never known existed. When he handed them to me, his fingers brushed mine for a second. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice. "If you did not authorize these transfers," I looked at him. "I understand," I said. And I did. More than he realized. I placed the papers neatly into my purse, smoothing the edges so they would not bend. Then I stood up. "Is there anything else I should know?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There have been deposits too," he said. "Regular ones. From an older account. Likely your father's original fund. It has been growing. Growing. While it was being drained at the same time. I let that sit in my mind for a moment. The balance between what was taken and what was still there. "Thank you," I said. I meant it. Not just for the information. For the clarity. I walked out of the office, past the tellers, past the quiet line of customers waiting for their turn. The bank doors opened, and the cool air hit my face again. I stood there for a second, just outside, letting everything settle. 5 years. Jessica had been doing this for 5 years. Not once. Not by accident. Not a mistake. A pattern. A plan. I got into my car and closed the door. The sound echoed in the quiet space, sharper than it should have been. I placed my purse on the passenger seat and rested my hands on the steering wheel again. This time, they did not feel the same. They felt steady, certain. I thought about the kitchen, about yesterday afternoon, about the way she had smiled and said it did not exist, about the way Daniel had not looked up. I understood now. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. I did not start the car right away. Instead, I opened my purse and took out the papers again. I flipped through them slowly, page by page, letting my eyes trace every line, every number, every date. It was all there. Nothing hidden. Nothing complicated. Just consistent. Careful. Quiet. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the amount. Not the total. The method. She had not taken everything at once. She had taken just enough each time that no one would notice. Especially someone like me. Someone who had been taught not to ask questions. Someone who had trusted the people around her. I closed the folder and placed it back in my purse. Then I started the car. The drive home felt shorter this time. Or maybe I was just not paying attention to the road the same way. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it had that morning. Still, quiet, ordinary. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, looking at it. This place where I had lived for years. This place where everything had slowly changed without me noticing. I stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. Jessica was in the kitchen again, standing at the counter, her back to me. Daniel was at the table, same as before. Same posture. Same phone. "You are back early," she said without turning around. Her voice was light. Casual. I placed my purse on the chair and took off my coat. "I had a few things to take care of," I said. She turned then, wiping her hands on a towel. Her eyes moved to my face, searching. Not openly. Subtly. Carefully. "Everything okay?" she asked. I met her gaze. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I smiled. The same kind of smile she had given me yesterday. Calm. Certain. Final. "Yes," I said. "Everything is perfectly clear now." Jessica held my gaze a second longer than usual, as if she were trying to read something behind my eyes, something I had not shown her before. Then she smiled again, softer this time, almost cautious, and turned back to the counter without another word. Daniel did not look up. He never did anymore. And that silence between us, the kind that used to feel comfortable, now felt like distance measured in years instead of feet. I moved slowly through the kitchen, taking a glass from the cabinet, filling it with water, letting the sound of the faucet cover the quiet tension that had settled into the room. I did not rush. I did not ask questions. I did not confront, because I understood now that whatever had been happening had not started yesterday, and it would not end in a single conversation. It had been built carefully, patiently, over time, and it would need to be unraveled the same way. I took a sip of water and set the glass down, my hands steady, my movements ordinary. That was important. Ordinary meant invisible, and invisible meant safe. Jessica glanced over her shoulder once more, just briefly, the kind of look people give when they are not sure if something has changed. I met her eyes again, just long enough, then looked away first. That mattered too. I did not want her to feel challenged. Not yet. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, the way most afternoons had passed in that house for years. Daniel left for work. Jessica made a phone call in the living room. Her voice low but controlled. I did not try to listen, not because I could not, but because I did not need to anymore. I already knew enough to change everything. I went back upstairs to my room and closed the door gently behind me. The same room that had once felt like mine now felt like a place I was allowed to stay. And that difference, small as it was, became impossible to ignore once you saw it clearly. I sat at the desk by the window and took the papers out of my purse again, laying them flat, aligning the edges, reading through them slowly. This time not as someone confused, but as someone learning, the dates, the amounts, the pattern. It was all there, not hidden, just unspoken. I traced one line with my finger, then another. 5 years of consistent withdrawals. Always just enough, never too much, never enough to raise suspicion. It was careful work, deliberate, and it told me something about Jessica that I had not fully understood before. This was not impulse. This was not desperation. This was planning. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to think. My father's voice came back to me. Again, clearer now than it had been in years. "This is your safety," he had said, Not Daniel's, not Jessica's, mine. And for the first time since that conversation in the kitchen, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding. How had she gained access? I opened my eyes and looked at the documents again, searching for something I had missed: authorization signatures, account changes, any detail that did not belong. And then I saw it. Not obvious, not at first glance, but there, a form. Reference number tied to a modification request, dated just over 5 years ago. I sat forward, my attention sharpening. That was the beginning. That was when it started. I reached for my phone and paused before unlocking it. I did not call anyone. Not yet. Information first, action later. That had always been my father's way. I placed the phone back down and instead took a pen from the drawer, writing down the reference number carefully on a separate piece of paper, along with the date. I would need that later. I stood up and walked to the closet again, pulling down another box, older this time, one I had not opened in years. Inside were documents from before Daniel was married, before Jessica had entered our lives. I went through them slowly, methodically, and then I found it. A copy of my signature from an old bank authorization form. I placed it next to the printed transaction sheets and looked between them, comparing the shape, the curve, the spacing. They were close enough that most people would not question it, but not exact, not mine. I felt something shift again, not surprise, not anger, just confirmation. I placed both papers side by side and took a picture with my phone. Then another, making sure the details were clear. I did not rush. Every step mattered now. Every detail would matter later. I returned everything to the box except the documents I needed, those I kept with me, sliding them back into my purse. When I left my room, the house was quiet again. Jessica was no longer in the living room. I could hear movement upstairs, soft footsteps, a door closing. I walked into the kitchen and stood there for a moment, looking at the space differently than I had. That morning, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I opened the refrigerator, took out a container, then put it back without opening it. The routine of the house felt like a performance I no longer needed to believe in. I checked the clock. It was just after 3 in the afternoon. Enough time. I picked up my purse again and headed for the door. This time I did not hesitate. I locked it behind me and walked to my car. As I drove, I did not think about confrontation or what I would say, or how Daniel would react. Those things would come later. What mattered now was understanding the full picture. The bank had shown me part of it, but not all. 5 years of transactions did not happen without structure, without support. There were forms, approvals, systems that allowed it. And somewhere in those systems was the proof I needed. I pulled into a parking space near a small office building just 10 minutes from the bank, a place I had not visited in a long time, not since my husband was alive. The sign by the door still read the same name, Harrison Legal Services. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. This was the next step, not emotional, not reactive, but deliberate. I opened the door, stepped out, and walked inside. The receptionist looked up as I entered, her expression polite but curious. I gave my name, and within minutes, I was seated across from a man who had once helped my husband review contracts. His hair was grayer now, his posture slower, but his eyes were the same, sharp, attentive. "Margaret," he said, leaning forward slightly. "What can I do for you?" I placed the documents on his desk, one by one, without explanation, without emotion, and watched as he began to read, his expression changing the same way the bank managers had, slowly. Then completely, he looked up at me, and for the first time that day, someone asked the question that mattered. "Did you authorize any of this?" I met his gaze and answered simply, "No." And in that moment, everything that had been quiet for 5 years finally had a voice. He did not react immediately after I said no. He simply leaned back in his chair and looked at me in a way that made it clear he understood more than I had said. His fingers tapped once against the desk before he reached for the documents again, reviewing them with a slower, more deliberate focus. "Margaret," he said after a moment, his voice measured, "this is not a misunderstanding." I nodded, not because I needed confirmation, but because hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way numbers alone could not. "These transfers required authorization," he continued, "either your direct consent or a verified change to the account access." I remained silent, letting him continue, because I knew each word mattered now. "And this," he said, tapping lightly on the reference number I had written down. This is the key. This is where access was modified. I leaned forward. Slightly. Can we trace it? I asked, my voice calm. Steady. He gave a small nod. The kind professionals give when they know something is possible, but not simple. It will take a formal request, he said. But yes, we can trace who submitted the change and how it was approved. I placed my hands flat on the desk, not tense, just present. Do it, I said, and there was no hesitation in my voice. Not anymore. He studied me for a brief moment, perhaps expecting doubt or emotion, but there was none to offer. Only clarity. All right, he said, reaching for a form. We will start with a request to the bank's compliance department, and we will also prepare documentation in case this needs to escalate legally. The word legally did not alarm me. It settled something instead, like placing a piece exactly where it belonged. He slid the form toward me. I will need your signature here, he said. I took the pen and signed without pause, my name written clean and firm, not like the imitation I had seen earlier, not like the version that had been used without my knowledge. Mine was exact, deliberate, undeniable. He took the paper back and placed it neatly on top of the stack. There is something else, he added, glancing at the documents again. The pattern of withdrawals suggests intent, not error. Whoever did this understood how to avoid detection. I met his gaze. I know, I said quietly, because that was the part that stayed with me. Not the money, not even the time, but the patience, the control, the quiet confidence that no one would notice, or worse, that no one would question. He nodded once, then leaned back again. Do you want to confront her? He asked, not as advice, but as an option. I shook my head. No, I said. Not yet. He did not ask why. He did not need to. He had seen this before in different forms, different families, different circumstances, but the same pattern. Emotion first, action second, or in my case, action first, emotion later. Good, he said simply. Then we proceed carefully. I gathered the copies he had made, placing them back into my purse, each movement controlled, intentional, as if the act of organizing the papers helped organize everything else in my mind. When I stood up, he stood as well. I will call you as soon as we have a response, he said. I nodded. Thank you. I replied, and I meant that too. Not for solving it, but for helping me see it clearly. Outside, the late afternoon light had shifted, softer now, longer shadows stretching across the parking lot. I walked to my car without rushing. The world around me unchanged. Cars passing, people talking, doors opening and closing. Ordinary life continuing exactly as it had before. And that was the strange part. How something so significant could exist quietly beneath something so normal. I sat in the driver's seat and closed the door, placing my purse beside me. I did not open it this time. I did not need to check anything again. I already knew what was inside. What mattered now was what came next. I started the engine and pulled out slowly, my thoughts not scattered, not racing, but aligned, step by step. First confirmation, then documentation, then control. I repeated it in my head like a sequence. Not out of fear, but out of precision. When I pulled back into the driveway, the house looked the same as it had every other time, but I no longer saw it the same way. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, not hesitating, just acknowledging the shift. Then I stepped out and walked inside. The door closed behind me with a quiet click. Jessica was in the living room this time, sitting on the couch with her phone in her hand. She looked up when I entered, her expression neutral, but her eyes moved quickly, assessing, measuring, the way they had earlier. You have been out a while, she said, her tone casual, but there was something under it now, something sharper. I placed my purse on the table and removed my coat, hanging it neatly. I had a few things to organize, I said, my voice even. She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded slightly. Well, dinner will be ready soon, she replied, turning her attention back to her phone, as if the moment had passed, but it had. Not for me. I moved through the house with the same steady rhythm as before, each step measured, each action familiar, but now I was aware of everything, the placement of objects, the timing of movements, the subtle shifts in tone. It was all information, and I was paying attention in a way I had not before. Later that evening, Daniel returned, his routine unchanged, brief greeting, quick glance, then back to his phone. I watched him for a moment, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with distance, the kind that comes when you realize someone has already stepped away from you long before you noticed. Dinner was quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a room without anyone acknowledging it. Jessica spoke about small things, errands, plans, details that did not matter. Daniel responded occasionally, but his attention remained divided. I listened, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see if anything would reveal itself, a word, a glance, a hesitation, something that did not fit. But nothing did. Not yet. She was careful, consistent, practiced. After dinner, I stood and began clearing the table, the same way I always had. Jessica moved to help, her movements efficient, controlled. "You seem quiet today," she said, not looking at me directly, just enough to place the observation without making it a question. I placed a plate in the sink and turned on the water, letting it run for a moment before answering. "I have been thinking," I said simply. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, then continued rinsing a glass. "About what?" she asked, still casual, still controlled. I turned slightly toward her, meeting her eyes fully this time, holding it just long enough to let the moment register. "About what belongs to me," I said, and for the first time since this had begun, her expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. A small shift, a brief tightening, a flicker that lasted less than a second. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm surface she had shown before. "Of course," she said lightly. "Everything here is for you." I nodded once, slowly, then turned back to the sink, the water running steadily, the dishes stacking neatly, the house returning to its usual rhythm. But underneath that rhythm, something had already begun to move, quietly, deliberately, and this time, I was the one in control. That flicker in her eye stayed with me long after the dishes were done and the kitchen was quiet again. It was small, almost invisible. But once you see something like that, you cannot unsee it. I dried my hand slowly and placed the towel back in its place, every movement calm, controlled, as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything had already shifted into something sharper, something more precise. I did not look at her again that night, not because I was avoiding her, but because I no longer needed to search for answers in her face. I already had them. I went upstairs earlier than usual, and closed my door behind me. The sound soft but final. My room felt different now, not smaller, not colder, just clearer, like a place where things could be understood without interruption. I sat at the desk and took out the documents again, not to reread them, but to arrange them, to prepare them. There is a difference between knowing something and organizing it, and I needed both. I aligned the pages, grouped the transactions by date, separated the authorization reference, placed the comparison of signatures side by side, each piece building something larger than itself, something that could not be dismissed or explained away. I took my phone and opened the photos I had taken earlier, zooming in on the signatures, studying the differences again, the slight hesitation in the curve, the uneven spacing. The imitation was good, but not perfect, and that imperfection was enough. It always is. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me. This was no longer about suspicion. This was structure, and structure meant control. I reached into the drawer and took out a small notebook, one I had not used in years, and began writing dates, amounts, reference numbers, names, not because I might forget, but because writing makes things real in a different way, more deliberate, more permanent. I wrote slowly, carefully, making sure each detail was clear, legible, undeniable. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it beside the documents. Then I turned off the light and sat there in the dim glow from the window, thinking, not about what had happened, but about what would happen next. The next morning began like any other, quiet, routine, predictable. I woke before sunrise, dressed, and went downstairs. Jessica was already in the kitchen, which was unusual. She rarely woke before me. She glanced at me as I entered, her expression neutral, but there was something behind it now, something watchful. "You are up early," she said, her tone light but measured. I nodded, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "So are you," I replied. She smiled slightly. "I could not sleep," she said. I did not ask why. I did not need to. We moved around each other in silence, the kind that is not uncomfortable, but aware. Like two people standing on opposite sides of something neither has named yet. Daniel came down a few minutes later, his routine unchanged, brief greeting, quick glance, then back to his phone. I watched him for a moment, not with expectation, not anymore, just observation. He sat at the table, scrolling, unaware of the shift that had already taken place, unaware that the ground beneath all of us had already begun to move. After breakfast, he left for work, and the house grew quiet again. Jessica began cleaning the counter, her movements precise, controlled. I stood by the window, holding my coffee, looking out at the street, the same street I had watched for years, the same neighbors, the same cars passing by, everything ordinary. And yet, I no longer felt part of that ordinary. I set the cup down and turned toward her. I have an appointment today, I said, my voice calm, steady. She paused, just slightly, then nodded. All right, she replied, not asking where, not asking why, which told me more than if she had. I picked up my purse and coat, moving toward the door. Do you need anything while I am out? I asked, the same question I had asked countless times before. She shook her head. No, I am fine, she said. And for a moment, her voice was almost too quick. I nodded and stepped outside, closing the door behind me. The air was cooler than the day before, sharper, clearer. I walked to my car and got in, placing my purse beside me. I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I took out the notebook and looked at the page I had written, the lines clean, the information organized. This was no longer just something I had discovered. It was something I could prove. I placed the notebook back in my purse and started the car. The drive to the bank felt different this time, not uncertain, not exploratory, but purposeful. When I arrived, I did not hesitate. I walked inside and asked for the manager again. The same man from yesterday greeted me, his expression attentive, as if he had expected me to return. Mrs. Collins, he said, standing. How can I assist you today? I placed the documents on his desk, along with the notebook, opening it to the page I had written. I need to secure this account, I said, my voice even. He looked at the papers, then back at me, understanding. Settling quickly. Of course, he replied, sitting down and turning to his computer. We can place restrictions immediately. No further withdrawals without direct verification. I nodded. Do that, I said. He began typing, his movements efficient, precise, the sound of the keys steady in the quiet room. There is something else, I added, and he looked up. I want a full access log, I said. Every change, every authorization, every request tied to this account. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. That will require a formal request, but it can be done. I held his gaze. Start it, I said, and there was no uncertainty in my voice, none at all. He nodded again and began preparing the necessary forms. As he worked, I sat back in the chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, not tense, not restless, just ready, because this was no longer about discovering what had been done. It was about taking back what had always been mine, quietly, deliberately, and this time, completely. He worked quickly after that, printing forms, making calls I could not hear, his voice lowered just enough to keep things contained within the walls of that office. But I did not need to hear every word to understand what was happening. The process had begun, and once something like this begins, it does not simply stop halfway. We will place a temporary hold on outgoing transfers, he said, glancing at me as he typed, and require in-person verification for any future access. I nodded once. That was enough, not everything at once, just enough to shift control. He printed another document and slid it across the desk. This authorizes the restriction, he said. I signed again, my name steady, consistent. Mine. He collected the papers and organized them into a file, precise, efficient, as if he understood the importance of order in a situation like this. You will likely notice a response, he added, not looking up this time. Whoever has been accessing the account will be blocked. I let that settle for a moment, not as a warning, but as a confirmation. Good, I said quietly. When I left the bank, the air felt different again, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like something that had been blurred was now in focus. I walked to my car and sat down, placing my purse beside me. This time I did not open it. I did not need to check anything. I knew what was inside, and more importantly, I knew what was already in motion. I started the engine and drove home. The same road, the same turns, the same buildings, but my attention was not on any of it. It was on timing, on sequence, on what would happen when Jessica realized she no longer had access. When the quiet system she had relied on stopped responding the way it always had. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. The house stood exactly as it always did, still, ordinary, unchanged on the outside. I stepped out and walked inside, the door closing softly behind me. Jessica was in the kitchen again, standing at the counter, her phone in her hand, her posture slightly different this time, less relaxed, more alert. She looked up as soon as I entered, faster than usual. "You are back," she said, her voice light, but her eyes moved quickly, searching, measuring. I placed my purse on the chair and removed my coat, hanging it neatly. "Yes," I said simply. She held my gaze for a second longer than she needed to, then looked down at her phone again, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Too quickly, I moved to the sink and rinsed my hands, the water running steadily, filling the space with a familiar sound. I did not ask what she was doing. I did not comment. I simply stood there, present, aware. After a moment, her phone buzzed. A short, sharp sound that cut through the quiet. She glanced at it. And that was when I saw it. Not the message itself, but the reaction. Her expression tightened, just slightly, her shoulders stiffened, and for a brief moment, she forgot to mask it. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm surface she always wore. But I had already seen enough. She turned slightly away from me, as if adjusting her position, but really creating distance. Her voice came a second later, carefully neutral. "I need to step outside for a moment," she said. I nodded without turning. "Of course," I replied. She walked past me, her movements controlled but quicker than usual, and the door opened and closed behind her with a little more force than necessary. I turned off the water and dried my hands slowly, placing the towel back in its place. Everything in its place, that mattered now. The house was quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. This quiet had weight, tension, awareness. I walked to the window and looked out. Jessica stood near the edge of the driveway, her back to the house, her phone pressed to her ear, her posture rigid. I could not hear her words, but I did not need to. The conversation was already written in her movements, in the way she shifted her weight, in the way her free hand moved slightly as she spoke, controlled, but not calm. I watched for a moment, then stepped back from the window. I did not need to observe every detail, just enough to confirm what I already knew. I moved into the living room and sat down, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my breathing steady. There was no urgency, no rush, because the moment had already passed. The shift had already happened. After a few minutes, the door opened again. Jessica stepped inside, her expression composed, but not as smooth as before. She glanced at me briefly, then walked into the kitchen without speaking. I did not look at her right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough. Then I stood and walked in. "Everything all right?" I asked, my voice even, neutral. She turned toward me, her smile returning, but not fully, not naturally. "Yes," she said, a fraction too quickly. "Just a small issue with the bank." I held her gaze, just for a second, then nodded. "Those things happen," I said, and turned away, reaching for a glass, filling it with water, the sound of the faucet steady, familiar, grounding. Behind me, she did not speak again, and that silence said more than anything she could have explained. Later that evening, Daniel returned, his routine unchanged, greeting, phone, distance, but Jessica was different, not dramatically, not in a way he would notice, but I did. Her attention moved between him and her phone more frequently, her responses shorter, her movements slightly sharper, like someone adjusting to something unexpected. During dinner, she spoke less, listening more, watching, calculating. Daniel did not notice. He rarely did. I ate slowly, calmly, as I always had. The same movements, the same pace, nothing out of place, but inside, everything was aligned. Every step leading to the next. After dinner, I stood and began clearing the table. Jessica moved to help, her movements precise, controlled, but not as effortless as before. "I might need to go to the bank tomorrow," she said casually, not looking at me, just placing the words into the air. I nodded, placing a plate in the sink. It is a good idea to keep things in order, I replied, my tone steady. She paused, just for a moment, then continued rinsing a glass. Yes, she said quietly. And that was all. But it was enough, because now, for the first time in 5 years, she was the one reacting, and I was the one already prepared. The next morning, I did not wake early. I woke on time. Exactly the way I always had. Because routine is the easiest thing to trust when everything else has shifted. The house was quiet when I stepped downstairs, but it was not the same quiet as before. It carried something under it now. Something alert. Something waiting. Jessica was already dressed, standing by the counter with her phone in her hand, her coat draped over the chair. She looked up the moment she heard me, faster than usual. I have an appointment this morning, she said before I could speak, her tone light, but placed too quickly, like she had rehearsed it. I nodded, pouring myself a cup of coffee. So do I replied, and that was the first time I saw it clearly. The hesitation, not in her face, but in the space between her movements. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, then recovered. At the bank, she added, as if clarifying something I had not asked. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the liquid move. In small circles, that seems to be a popular place this week, I said, my voice even. She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. Just routine, she said. I nodded, taking a sip, not responding further, because there was nothing to respond to. We both already knew what was happening. Daniel came down a few minutes later, his routine unchanged. Greeting, phone, distance. Jessica glanced at him once, briefly, then back at me, measuring something, calculating something. I did not interrupt that silence. I let it sit, because silence has a way of revealing more than words ever do. After breakfast, Daniel left first. As always, Jessica waited a few minutes, then picked up her coat, her movements controlled, but not as smooth as they once were. I will be back later, she said, not looking directly at me this time. I nodded. Drive safely, I replied. She hesitated at the door, just long enough to suggest she might say something else. Then she left, the door closing behind her with a firm, deliberate sound. I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet settle again. Then I placed my cup in the sink and turned off the light. I did not rush. I did not change my pace. I moved through the house the same way I always had, because there was no reason to change what already worked. I picked up my purse, checked that everything was inside, the documents, the notebook, the copies, everything in order. Then I stepped outside, locking the door behind me. The air was crisp, clear, the kind that sharpens your focus whether you want it to or not. I got into my car and started the engine. This time, I did not go directly to the bank. Instead, I drove slowly, taking a different route, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to arrive after she did. Timing mattered now. When I reached the bank, I did not park in my usual spot. I chose a space farther down, one that gave me a clear view of the entrance without being obvious, and I waited. Not long, just enough. Within minutes, I saw her car pull in. She parked quickly, stepped out, and walked inside without hesitation, her posture straight, her movements controlled, but faster than usual. I watched until the door closed behind her. Then I counted to 10, slowly, deliberately, and stepped out of my car. The bank doors opened as I approached. The familiar scent, the quiet atmosphere, everything exactly as it had been. But this time, I was not here to ask questions. I was here to observe. I moved to the side, near the seating area, positioning myself where I could see the manager's office without drawing attention. And there she was, standing at the desk, speaking to the same man I had met, her posture composed, her expression calm. But her hands, they told the truth. They moved. Slightly, controlled, but not still. He listened, nodding occasionally, then typed something into his computer. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. I could see the moment it happened. The shift, his posture changed, just like it had the day before, his expression tightening slightly, becoming more formal, more cautious. Jessica leaned forward, speaking again, more quickly now, her composure slipping just enough to be visible if you knew what to look for. He shook his head once, then turned the screen slightly toward her, and I saw it. The reaction, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, she forgot to mask it. Then she stepped back, straightening, her expression smoothing over, but not fully, not perfectly. She said something else, shorter this time. Sharper, he responded, slower, more measured, then reached for a document. Placing it on the desk between them, she did not touch it immediately. She looked at it, then at him, then back at it, calculating, assessing, and that was when I knew, not just what she had done, but how she had done it. This was not new to her. This was not her first time managing something like this. But this time, the system had changed, the control had shifted, and she did not yet know how to adjust. I stood there for a moment longer, just long enough to confirm what I needed. Then I turned and walked out, the doors closing softly behind me. I did not wait for her to leave. I did not need to see the rest. I already knew how it would end. I returned to my car and sat down, placing my purse beside me, my hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. Everything was moving exactly as it should, step by step, sequence by sequence. I started the engine and drove away. Not back home. Not yet. There was one more step to take, one more piece to secure, and I intended to complete it before the day was over, because this was no longer about discovery. It was about resolution, and I was not going to leave anything unfinished. I drove past the familiar streets without really seeing them, the road unfolding in front of me as if it had already been decided long before I turned the wheel, because in a way, it had. Every step since that moment in the kitchen had followed a pattern, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate. And now there was only one piece left to secure before everything shifted completely. I pulled into the parking lot of Harrison Legal Services again, this time without hesitation, and stepped out of the car, the door closing with a quiet, final sound. Inside, the receptionist recognized me immediately and gave a small nod, as if she understood this was not a casual visit. Within minutes I was seated across from him again. The same desk, the same documents now placed neatly in front of me. I assume something has changed, he said, his tone calm but attentive. I placed my purse on the desk and opened it, taking out the updated papers from the bank, the restriction confirmation, the request logs, everything that had been set in motion just an hour earlier. She went to the bank this morning, I said, my voice steady. And she was denied. He watched me carefully, then glanced down at the documents, understanding forming quickly. Good, he said quietly, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. That means the restriction is active. I nodded, and it means she knows. I added. He leaned back slightly. Considering that, yes, he said after a moment. She knows something has changed, but she does not yet know how much you know. I let that settle, because that difference mattered. Knowledge is not just what you have. It is what the other person thinks you have. And right now, that imbalance was still in my favor. We need to move now, I said, not urgent, but precise. He nodded, already reaching for another file. I agree, he replied. The next step is to secure full legal control and document the unauthorized access. He opened the file and began laying out forms, each one aligned, structured, ready. This will formalize your authority over the account and prevent any further attempts to modify access. He explained. I listened, not because I needed to understand every legal term, but because I needed to understand the sequence, the structure, where each piece fit. And this, he said, tapping another document, initiates a formal inquiry into the unauthorized transactions. I looked at it, then back at him. How long? I asked before we have confirmation. He considered for a moment. A few days for the initial report, he said. Longer for a full investigation. I nodded. That was enough. I did not need everything immediately. I just needed it to begin. Prepare everything, I said, and there was no hesitation in my voice. Not anymore. He studied me for a brief moment, then nodded. All right, he said, sliding the first document toward me. Sign here. I took the pen and signed. Each line, each page, my name written. Clearly, consistently, the same way it had always been. Mine. Undeniable. He collected the papers and organized them into a file, his movements efficient, practiced. Once this is filed, he said, you will have full documented control, and any prior unauthorized activity will be formally recorded. I placed my hands flat on the desk, steady, grounded. Good, I said, because that was what this was about now. Not confrontation, not explanation, but control. When I stood to leave, He stood as. Well, I will contact you as soon as we receive the initial response, he said. I nodded. Thank you, I replied, and this time, it felt different, not just appreciation, but alignment. Outside, the afternoon had shifted into something quieter, the lights softer, the shadows longer. I walked to my car and sat down, placing my purse beside me. I did not open it. I did not check anything. I already knew what was inside. What mattered now was what was already in motion. I started the engine and drove home. The same road, the same turns, everything familiar, but my focus was not on the road. It was on timing, on sequence, on what would happen when Jessica returned, when she realized not just that she had been blocked, but that something else had been set in motion. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. The house stood quiet, unchanged, but I knew better now. I stepped out and walked inside, the door closing softly behind me. The house was empty. Jessica was not there yet. I placed my purse on the table and removed my coat, hanging it neatly, everything in its place. That mattered. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, not searching, not checking, just being present, aware, because awareness is what had been missing before, and I would not let that happen again. I sat in the living room, my hands resting calmly in my lap, the quiet settling around me, not empty, but full of what had been uncovered, what had been set in motion, what was about to unfold. Time passed, not quickly, not slowly, just steadily, and then I heard it. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the engine stopping, the door opening and closing, footsteps approaching. The front door opened, and Jessica stepped inside, her movements controlled. But there was something different now, something sharper, more focused. She saw me immediately, sitting there, waiting, not for her, but for the moment itself. You are back, she said, her voice even, but her eyes were not. They moved quickly, searching, measuring, calculating. I nodded once. So are you, I replied, and that was when the silence settled between us again. But this time, it was not uncertain, it was defined. She stepped further into the room, placing her bag on the table, her movements precise, deliberate. There seems to be an issue with the bank, she said, her tone carefully neutral. I held her gaze, just long enough, then nodded slightly. Yes, I said, I am aware. And for the first time, there was no flicker, no hesitation, just clarity, because now, everything was exactly where it needed to be. Jessica stood there for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes fixed on mine, searching for something that was no longer there, uncertainty, hesitation, weakness, but all she found was stillness, and that unsettled her more than anything I could have said. She shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her posture as if resetting herself. What do you mean you are aware? She asked, her tone controlled, but tighter now. I did not answer immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the question feel unnecessary. Then I stood slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to change the dynamic between us. I went to the bank yesterday, I said, my voice even, measured. Her expression did not break, but something behind it did, a small recalculation, a quiet shift. And today, I continued, I made sure everything was put back where it belongs. She did not respond right away, her mind moving quickly behind her still face. I do not understand what you are implying, she said, choosing each word carefully. I nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the effort, then walked past her into the kitchen, not dismissing her, but not engaging in her framing either. I filled a glass with water, the sound of the faucet steady, grounding, then turned back toward her, holding the glass loosely in my hand. You understand exactly what I am saying, I replied, and this time, I did not soften it. I did not leave space for interpretation, just clarity. She stepped forward slightly, closing the distance between us, her voice lowering, more direct now. If this is about the account, there must be some kind of mistake, she said. And there it was, the first shift in strategy, not denial, but redirection. I watched her for a moment, noticing how quickly she adjusted, how easily she moved from certainty to explanation. No, I said simply. There is no mistake. And that was the first time I saw it clearly, not just the tension, but the crack beneath it, small, controlled, but there. Her shoulders stiffened just slightly, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before she smoothed her expression again. Then perhaps there is something you do not fully understand, she said, her tone softening again. Almost patient, as if explaining something to someone who needed help keeping up. I placed the glass on the counter, the sound quiet but deliberate. I understand enough, I said, and I let that sentence sit between us, not aggressive, not defensive, just final. The silence that followed was different from the others, not uncertain, not searching, but defined, each of us standing exactly where we were, no longer circling, no longer pretending, just facing what had already been uncovered. After a moment, she stepped back, her expression shifting again, not to calm, but to calculation. Daniel should be part of this conversation, she said, and this time, her voice was firmer, more grounded. I nodded once. He will be, I replied, because I had already decided that, long before she suggested it. She studied me for a moment longer, as if trying to determine how much I had done, how far I had gone, how much control had already shifted, but there was no way for her to measure that now. Not anymore. She turned away first, moving toward the sink, picking up a dish that did not need to be moved, her hands occupied, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. I watched her for a moment, not out of suspicion, but out of understanding. This was no longer about catching her in something. It was about letting her realize she had already been seen. Later that evening, Daniel returned, his routine unchanged at first, greeting, phone, distance, but Jessica did not wait this time. She approached him almost immediately, her movements controlled but purposeful. We need to talk, she said, her voice steady, but carrying something under it now. Something sharper. He looked up, surprised, then glanced at me briefly, as if trying to understand what had shifted. I did not move, I did not speak. I simply sat there, present. About what? He asked, his tone neutral, but less certain than before. Jessica hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued. About the bank account, she said, and that was the moment everything aligned. He frowned slightly, looking between us. What bank account? He asked, confusion genuine this time. I stood slowly, not to interrupt, but to join. The one your grandfather left. For me, I said, my voice calm, clear. Daniel's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something else, something closer to awareness. I thought that was gone, he said, glancing at Jessica. She did not look at him immediately, her focus still on me. That is what I was told, I replied, holding his gaze just long enough. Then looking back at her, the silence stretched again, but this time, it was not empty. It was full of everything that had been hidden, everything that had been assumed, everything that was now being brought into the open without being forced. Daniel looked between us again, slower this time, more carefully. What is going on? He asked, and this time, the question mattered, because it was not casual, not distracted, but present. I did not answer right away. I let the moment settle, let him feel the weight of it. Then I spoke. For the past 5 years, I said, my voice steady. Money has been taken from that account without my authorization. His expression changed completely now, confusion replaced by something sharper, more focused. That is not possible, he said, but there was less certainty in it than there should have been. I nodded once. It is documented, I replied, and I saw it then, the shift, not just in him, but in the space between all three of us, the balance that had existed for years, quiet, unspoken, had finally moved, and this time, it had moved in my favor, and I did not need to raise my voice, or argue, or explain further, because the truth, once placed clearly in front of someone, does not need to be pushed, it simply waits, and I was more than willing to let it do exactly that. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, as if he were trying to place my words into a version of reality that still made sense to him. But nothing about this fit into the version he had been living in. That does not make sense, he said finally, his voice slower now, less certain. I did not interrupt him, I did not correct him, I simply let him sit with it, because understanding does not come from being told. It comes from being faced with something that cannot be ignored. Jessica, he said, turning toward her, what is she talking about? She did not answer immediately, and that pause, that brief hesitation, said more than anything she could have explained. She turned to him slowly, her expression composed, but not as smooth as before. There has been some confusion with an old account, she said, her tone controlled, measured. But I could see the effort now, the calculation behind each word. Daniel frowned, looking between us again. Confusion how? He asked, this time more directly. She took a small step toward him, placing herself slightly between him and me, not blocking, but positioning. Your grandfather set up a small account years ago, she said. It was not active for a long time, and when I reviewed it, there were some inconsistencies. I watched her carefully, not because I needed to catch her in something, but because I wanted to see how she would build her version, how she would shape it now that the ground beneath it had shifted. So I made adjustments to keep things organized, she continued, her voice steady, almost reassuring. Daniel looked at her, then at me. You adjusted her account, he said, and there was something in his tone now, not just confusion, but the beginning of something sharper. She held his gaze. It was necessary, she replied, and there it was, not denial, not apology, but justification. I stepped forward then, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to place myself back into the center of the conversation. No, I said calmly, and both of them turned toward me. It was not necessary. I continued, my voice even, but clear. It was unauthorized. The words settled into the room with a weight that could not be softened or redirected. Daniel's expression shifted again, more quickly this time. Unauthorized. He repeated, looking at Jessica. She did not respond immediately, and that silence, longer now, more visible, began to fill the space between them. Jessica, he said again, and this time, there was no confusion in his voice, only expectation. She exhaled slowly, then straightened slightly, as if deciding to change her approach. I handled it the way I thought was best for the household, she said, and this time, her tone was firmer, more defensive. I watched Daniel carefully, because this was the moment that mattered, not what she said, but how he received it. He looked at her, then at me, then back at her again, slower this time, more deliberate. For 5 years, he said quietly, and it was not a question, it was recognition. She did not answer right away, but her silence confirmed it more clearly than any explanation could have. I stepped closer to the table and placed my hand lightly on the back of the chair, grounding myself in the moment. There are records, I said, not to argue, not to prove, but to state. Dates, amounts, transfers, all documented. Daniel looked at me, his attention fully present now. And you are sure? He asked. I nodded once. I have verified everything, I replied. His jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time since this began, I saw something return to him that had been missing for a long time. Awareness. He turned back to Jessica, slower now, more controlled. Why would you do that without telling her? He asked, and this time, there was no softness in his voice, no distraction, just focus. Jessica's expression changed again, not to calm, not to reassurance, but to something closer to frustration. Because it needed to be handled, she said, her tone sharper now. She was not managing it, and I made sure it was taken care of. I did not react to the words themselves, but I noted the shift, the removal of pretense, the move from explanation to justification. Daniel stared at her, the silence stretching between them. That was not your decision to make, he said finally, and that sentence, simple as it was, marked the first clear break. She looked at him, her expression tightening. I was protecting our finances, she replied, and there it was again, the framing, the positioning, but it no longer held the same weight it once had, because now it was being questioned, not accepted. I remained still, present, letting the conversation move without interference, because this part was not mine to lead. It was his to understand. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to reconcile something that no longer fit. You were taking money from her account, he said, and this time, there was no question in it, only clarity. She did not deny it. She did not correct it. She simply stood there, her silence filling the space, and that silence was enough. I stepped back slightly, giving them room, not withdrawing, but allowing the moment to settle where it needed to, because this was no longer about uncovering what had happened. It was about acknowledging it, and once something is acknowledged, it cannot return to what it was before. Daniel looked down for a moment, then back up. His expression changed again, not confused, not uncertain, but resolved. This stops now, he said, and his voice, steady, clear, carried something that had been absent for a long time. Jessica did not respond immediately, her eyes moving between us, recalculating, reassessing, but the balance had already shifted, and there was no position she could take that would return it to where it had been. I picked up my glass from the counter and took a small sip, the water cool, steady, grounding, then set it back down, my movements unchanged, my posture calm, because this was not about winning, not about proving, it was about restoring. Something that had been quietly taken, piece by piece, over time, and now, piece by piece, it was being put back exactly where it belonged. The words settled into the room and did not leave, not immediately, not quietly, they stayed there, between all of us, shaping the space in a way that could not be undone. Daniel stood still for a moment after he said it, as if he were listening to his own voice, hearing something in it that had not been there before, something firm, something decided. Jessica did not move right away, her eyes fixed on him, searching for any sign that this might still be redirected, softened, managed, but there was none, and that was new. "You do not understand everything," she said finally, her voice lower now, more controlled, but also more careful. I did not respond, I did not step in, because this was no longer my moment to guide. It was his to recognize. Daniel shook his head slightly, not in confusion, but in refusal. "No," he said, "I understand enough." And that was all it took, not a long explanation, not an argument, just a line drawn clearly. Without hesitation, Jessica exhaled slowly, her shoulders lifting and settling again, as if she were adjusting to a new position she had not planned for. "I was trying to keep things stable," she said, and this time, there was less certainty in it, less control, more effort. I watched her carefully, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity, because now I could see the pattern fully, not just what she had done, but how she had justified it to herself, how she had framed it in a way that allowed her to continue without interruption. Daniel did not respond immediately. He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way I had not seen in a long time, as if he were seeing something new, or perhaps something that had always been there, but had not been acknowledged. "Stable for who?" he asked quietly, and the question landed exactly where it needed to, not loud, not aggressive, but precise. Jessica did not answer right away, and that silence, longer now, more exposed, began to fill the space between them again. I stepped slightly to the side, not leaving, but allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was not something that could be rushed or directed. It had to settle on its own. Daniel's expression did not change much, but his posture did. His shoulders straightened slightly, his attention fully present. "You should have told her," he said, and this time, there was no room in his voice for interpretation. Jessica's eyes flickered briefly, then steadied again. "It was not that simple," she replied, but even as she said it, the words felt thinner, less grounded. Daniel shook his head once more, slower now, more deliberate. "It was exactly that simple," he said, and that was the moment I felt the shift complete, not because of what was said, but because of what was no longer being accepted. I moved quietly toward the table and placed my hand on the back of the chair again, the same position as before, grounding myself in the space, not needing to speak, not needing to prove anything further, because the truth had already done its work. Jessica looked between us again, her expression changing, not dramatically, but enough, the calculation still there, but now layered with something else, something closer to uncertainty. "So what happens now?" she asked, and this time, the question was not rhetorical, it was real. Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked down for a moment, then back up, his gaze steady. "Now we fix it," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no distraction, just direction. Jessica nodded slowly, but it was not agreement, it was acknowledgement. The kind that comes when options have narrowed. I reached into my purse then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just calmly, and took out the folder I had been carrying, placing it on the table, the sound soft but deliberate. Both of them looked at it, then at me. "Everything is already being addressed," I said, my voice even, steady. "The account is secured, access is restricted, and a formal review has been initiated." Daniel's eyes moved to the folder, then back to me. "You have already taken care of it," he said, and there was something in his tone now, not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition. I nodded once. It was necessary. I replied, echoing the word that had been used earlier, but this time, placed where it belonged. Jessica's gaze lingered on the folder for a moment longer, then shifted away, her posture adjusting again, not defensive, not aggressive, but recalibrating. And the transactions? Daniel asked, his voice quieter now, more focused. I met his gaze. They are documented, I said. Every one of them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of what had been uncovered, what had been acknowledged, what could no longer be ignored. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance. Then we follow through, he said, and this time, it was not just a statement, it was a decision. I nodded, because that was all that was needed. No more explanation, no more argument, just movement forward. Jessica did not speak again for a while, her presence still there, but quieter now, more contained. The room felt different, not tense, not heavy, but settled, like something that had been out of place had finally been returned to where it belonged. And as I stood there, watching both of them, I realized something that had not been clear before. This was never just about the account, or the money, or even the 5 years that had passed. It was about something much simpler, much quieter. The moment you stop assuming everything is as it should be, and start seeing it as it is, because once you see it clearly, you do not need to fight for control. You simply take it back, step by step, without raising your voice, without losing your place. And that is exactly what I had done. The room did not return to what it had been before, not after that, not after everything had been said without needing to be repeated. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain or fragile. It was settled, defined, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I had not realized I had been missing. Not relief, not satisfaction, but balance. Daniel remained standing near the table, his eyes moving once more to the folder, then back to me, as if confirming that what had just happened was not temporary, not something that would fade by morning. When will we hear back? He asked, his voice steady, no longer distracted. I met his gaze. Soon, I said. The initial report will come first, then the full review. He nodded slowly, absorbing that, not questioning it, not avoiding it, just accepting the process as it was. Jessica stood a few feet away, her posture composed but quieter now. The sharp edges of her earlier control softened into something more contained. She did not interrupt. She did not redirect. And that absence of control was more telling than anything she could have said. I moved to the chair and sat down, not out of fatigue, but out of choice, placing myself in the space without tension, without urgency, because there was nothing left to push. Everything that needed to move was already in motion. The evening continued in a way that felt almost familiar, but not quite the same. Dinner was quieter, not forced, not uncomfortable, just different. Words were spoken when necessary, but not to fill space. Daniel asked a few practical questions about the account, about the process, about what would happen next, and I answered each one simply, clearly, without adding more than was needed. Jessica listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally adding a short response, but her tone remained measured, careful, as if she were recalibrating each word before allowing it to leave her. After dinner, the house settled into its usual rhythm, but I did not move through it the same way. I was aware now, not just of what was around me, but of my place within it. I cleared the table slowly, placing each dish in the sink, the sound of water running steady and familiar, grounding. Jessica joined me without speaking, her movements precise, controlled, but no longer leading, just following the rhythm that had already been set. Daniel remained at the table for a moment longer, then stood and stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him. I did not watch him leave. I did not need to. I knew what he was doing, not escaping, not avoiding, but thinking, processing, the same way I had, just at a different pace. When the dishes were done, I dried my hands and placed the towel back in its place, then turned off the light, the kitchen falling into a quiet dimness. I walked to the living room and sat down, the same chair, the same position, but not the same perspective. Jessica remained in the kitchen for a moment longer, then joined me, sitting across from me, not too close, not too far, the distance measured, intentional. I did not think it would come to this, she said after a while, her voice lower. Now, less controlled, more honest. I looked at her, not with anger, not with judgment, just with clarity. It already had. I replied, and I did not need to explain what I meant. She understood. Her eyes lowered slightly, then lifted again. I thought I was managing things, she said. And there was something different in her tone now. Not justification, not defense, but reflection. I nodded once. You were managing what was not yours to manage, I said, my voice calm, steady. She did not respond immediately, and that silence, this time, was not resistance, it was acknowledgement. Daniel returned a few minutes later, stepping inside quietly, his expression thoughtful, composed. He looked at both of us, then took a seat, not at the table this time, but closer, part of the space, not removed from it. We will handle this properly, he said, his voice firm, but not harsh. I nodded. Because that was all that needed to be said, the rest would follow, the reports, the documentation. The formal process, each step already in motion. The night moved forward without urgency, without conflict, just a steady progression toward what had already been set in place. Later, when I went upstairs, I did not feel the need to check the documents again. I did not need to review the numbers or the signatures. I already knew them. I already understood them. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, looking at the room. The same room that had once felt uncertain, now quiet, steady, mine. I turned off the light and lay down. Not restless, not unsettled, just aware. The house around me silent, but not empty. Morning came the same way it always does, gradually, quietly, without asking if you were ready for it. I woke before the alarm, sat up, and listened for a moment. The house was still. Jessica had not come downstairs yet. Daniel's door remained closed, everything as it should be. I dressed, made my way to the kitchen, and began my usual routine, coffee, water, the small movements. That marked the beginning of a day. But this day felt different, not because something had ended, but because something had been restored, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, step by step, exactly the way it needed to be. When Jessica came downstairs, she paused for a moment at the doorway, then stepped in, her expression composed, but softer now, less guarded. "Good morning," she said, and this time, the words were not placed, they were simply spoken. I nodded. "Good morning," I replied. Daniel joined us shortly after, his routine quieter, more present, his phone left on the counter instead of in his hand. He looked at me, then at Jessica, then back at me again, not uncertain, not divided, just aware. And in that moment, I understood something that had not been clear before. This was never about taking something from them or proving something to them. It was about returning something to myself, something that had been slowly moved out of reach without me noticing, and now, just as quietly, it had been placed back where it belonged. I picked up my cup and took a sip, the coffee warm, steady, familiar, then set it down, my hands calm, my thoughts clear, because once you see things as they are, you do not need to hold on to what they were. You simply move forward with what is, and that is exactly what I intended to do.